So I think, so in terms of my pedagogy, I mean, I think that that's changed a lot over the last few years in particular. I taught for a few years doing kind of short-term contracts and honestly didn't really spend a lot of time thinking about pedagogy or assessment. I just kind of like did what I knew, and what I knew was what I had learned. And so when I first went into a classroom where I started really thinking about these things, I realized that, in the time that had gone since I was in high school to when I was teaching now, like the world had changed. Social media had blown up, the internet had brought in new things. And I just, was coming to this realization that like I can't teach the way that I was taught, no matter how much. I just kind of wanted to teach the way that I had learned when I was younger, because I was somebody who grew up wanting to be a teacher, who spent my whole school career watching teachers because I just wanted to be one. And I really loved school. And so to me, my educational experiences were like, yeah, that's what school's going to look like as a teacher. And then, I quickly realized like that's not the case. It's very different being on the other side. Um, and so in terms of assessment, when I first started, so I teach high school ELA is my main area. And when I first started assessing students, I was in my first couple of years, I was in survival. I'd pull rubrics from the internet. I would pull rubrics from other people's assignments. I'd pull rubrics from the copy room that someone left behind, just like pulling things from resources from wherever you can get them. And I would use them, and I'd put them up against an assignment, and I'd think to myself like, yep, this assignment or this assessment is for a literary essay. It makes sense that I will use this for my literary essay. And then I just started to realize that like my instruction and my assessment weren't matching up. So what I would notice is that I'd be assessing a student and I'd look at it and think, this is a really good paper. Why is it only scoring a 70%? Or this is a really crappy paper. Why is it scoring a 90%? But when you line it up on the, on a rubric, it's like, well, yeah, they did do this at a, 3 out of 4, 4 out of 4 level. So that's what they earned. And so I really started to question kind of like, why do we assess the way we do? How do we align our rubrics so that they actually are intertwined with the instruction? Because I think we often look at assessment and instruction as two separate parts, but they're not. They're intertwined. They go together. And so while planning instruction, we need to be planning assessment and vice versa. And I just started to realize that even though I was trying really hard to make rubrics, match up, they still weren't telling a whole story. They weren't telling a story about a student's abilities. They weren't telling a story about a student's knowledge. All they were telling me was that a student was compliant with the things on the list of the rubric, right? Which we as education students and teachers are all familiar with. How many times have you done an assignment, looked at the 4 out of the 4 on the rubric and said, okay, I did this, I did this, I did this, I did this, and didn't reach beyond that at all, right? So at this point, I kind of started my, I don't know what I would call like a deep dive into assessment and what I'm really doing in the classroom, and, how authentic my assessment is. And I started questioning, I don't know, just like our grading system in general, and saying like, why do we do this? Because this kid earned an 82 on this rubric. This kid earned an 87. Is there a difference between them? I'm not really sure, but this kid's going to get a scholarship and this kid isn't. So, but what's the real difference here, right? So I started really questioning my grading practices. And then, so I had done some research, and at the time had spoken with some colleagues, and somebody had suggested 1-point rubrics. And so then I started transitioning to 1-point rubrics. So essentially, like I printed a picture to show you. So this would have been like what one of my, first rubrics had looked like. I have the 1, 2, 3, 4, the very clear descriptions, and it was all laid out. And I would go through and I would highlight where they fell and maybe add, a little bit of feedback on the paper on the bottom. But it would be like, this is the grade. I gave you the grade, we're done here, right? And then switching to 1-point rubrics started me adding more feedback to assessment, because a 1-point rubric looks more like this. So you have the criterion along the side. You list what 3 out of 4 looks like, but you don't tell them specifically what a 1, 2, or 4 out of 4 looks like. So when I started using these rubrics, high achievers hated me. They were like, what is this witchiness? They couldn't grasp onto this idea that they weren't being told exactly what to do, right? And so, I would give them the 3 out of the 4. The 3 out of 4 is what it means to meet expectations. You meet my expectations, you earn a 75, 80%, and we're good to go. And what I started noticing was that students who wanted that 4 out of 4, were able to start looking at assignments in a way that allowed them to bring themselves into the work. Instead of just being compliant and checking off a 4 out of 4, they were like, well, how do I get beyond the 3? What does that look like? What can I do better than what she says meeting expectations is? And it started to make students push harder, and it started to make me assess more authentically, because now, instead of having this rubric that just has highlighter all over it, I have this rubric where, in this category, say at the top in their intro and conclusion, they've really done an exceptional job. They have a beautiful thesis, all of these things. I'm going to put them in the 4 out of 4, and I'm going to tell them why. I'm going to write in the 4 out of 4 column and say, you eloquently put this, your thesis wasn't prescriptive, things like that. And so they're getting more pointed feedback that says, these are actually the things you did really well. And on the other side of it, if you're scoring a 2, this is why you scored a 2. It's because you didn't quite reach this expectation. And if you're scoring a 1, it's like you didn't really do the assignment at all. So, I moved into transitioning into using these kind of rubrics. Using those kind of rubrics, I was still using a 1, 2, 3, 4 out of 4 model. So, this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, has 7 criterion. The assignment would have been out of 28. I still take all those 3s, score them, they get whatever mark they get. And so this was going really well, but then I started to notice that I was putting so much work into feedback and they weren't taking it. And because, the 1-point rubric requires a lot more effort on my part to actually be thoughtful about the assessment I'm doing. And I was being more thoughtful, and then they were still just taking it and tossing it in the recycling bin. And I would just it's devastating. It's heartbreaking. You just spent all this time assessing these essays and giving all this feedback, and they're like, oh, great, 82 in the garbage, right? And not only was that, in my opinion, saying something about my assessment, but it was saying something about how they valued school and how they valued learning, right? And it just started me on this path of what are we doing here? What are we doing in school? What's the point of all of this? Because if the point is that kids come and they're compliant and they do what they've been asked and they leave and they graduate, it's that's lame. I don't want to do that, right? I don't want to prepare kids to work in a factory. I want to prepare kids to think and to, question the world and analyze the way things work. And so I started leaning more into this idea of going gradeless. And so now my high school ELA classes are all gradeless. I don't put grades on any assignments. The way it works is that, and it's a process, there's a lot of steps that go into this process. And I wanted to show you the book. So this book by Sarah M. Zerwin called Pointless was kind of my launching point for going gradeless in my classroom. This book really helped me kind of formulate my thinking around it and actually put it into practice, not just as this big cool idea. And so now basically what happens is 2 times throughout the semester, I either meet with students or we conference digitally, like through messaging and stuff. And we do goal setting, they reflect and they say, okay, this is where I'm at right now. And this is the grade I think I've earned so far. And this is based on a holistic rubric that they fill in and they assess themselves on. And I say, when I give them, I should go back a second here. When I give them a rubric now in my grade list system, this is what it looks like. So on one side you have progressing, on one side you have exceeding, and in the middle you have meeting. And then the side is filled with empty space for my feedback. And so I don't often end up writing like, if they're exceeding, it all goes on this, like, I just kind of like write on the paper and it's kind of a disaster, but they figure it out. And so that's what my rubrics look like now. And the way that it works now is that they give me the paper, I fill in the rubric, assess, give it back to them, and the assignment is not considered complete unless they use the feedback and hand it back in. So the only way that they can earn a complete grade in EDSB or in gradebook is that they have to take the feedback and improve the piece. Otherwise, it's considered like half done. It's not finished. And so then they give it back to me and I assess again, but this time more focused on like, and by assess, I mean, this time it's like, you know, I really loved that you took this feedback and I think you really improved this part of your essay. And if you want to continue improving, here's something you should think about. And that's it. That's the end of the assessment. And so in terms of like the growth and change of my pedagogy, I believe that good teachers are constantly reflecting and we're constantly thinking about how we can do it better. And I think in terms of assessment often gets left behind in that practice. We think about instruction, we think about, you know, you teach something one day in period 1 and it goes terribly and you have to teach that class again in period 4. So you're like, let's fix this. I need to do something different. And you fix that, but the assessment stays the same, right? We don't think about necessarily the assessment and the instruction as like one piece. And I think if we're talking about how my views have changed over time, that's a big part of it, is that I've realized how connected the two are. And I think what really caused the shift was just assessing and seeing like, this isn't really cutting it. It's not really working. As teachers, we just don't have the time or capacity to differentiate all of our lessons, all of our assessments for every individual student. And at the rate things are going, it's going to get worse. And we just don't have the support in schools that we need. So, you know, I think about ways to differentiate, and oftentimes that requires another body, right? It requires an EA or another teacher or other support, because in a class of 30, no matter how well you differentiate an assignment or modify it or whatever you want to do, there's still going to be kids who need more support. Like that's just the reality of it. And classroom teachers are just kind of left to figure it out themselves. You know, we get told at the start of a semester, these are the kids you have, X, Y, and Z, and this kid needs this, and this kid needs this, and this kid needs this. Oh, and you have this kid, and he comes sometimes, not all the time, and you need to accommodate that. And, you know, you get this list of like, these are all the things you have to deal with this semester. And we're just kind of, we're like left to figure out what that looks like. And so I don't think that, or I do think that there are a lot of limitations on our ability to differentiate well. That being said, I do think that there are good teaching practices that support more learners. So I might not have time to differentiate a lesson or whatever for all students, but I can make sure that I have tools available to every student to support the ones who need it. So as an example, I might provide graphic organizers. I might make a checklist to make sure that for my own brain that I've checked in with all the kids at some point that day, or frequent conferencing, flexible due dates, flexible ways of meeting outcomes, and differentiation, I think, is one thing that you also just get better at as time goes on. It's not something I think is realistic to expect of brand new teachers, to be able to differentiate and to adapt things for all students. I think about right now, I have B10 class, ELA B10, and I have my regular students, I have a couple modified students, and then I have a couple functionally integrated students. And so in terms of planning and doing differentiation for them, it's, I start by planning the lesson for typical students, whatever that means, but for the typical students, and then I take it and modify it for my modified students. So, as an example, right now we're working on Macbeth in B10, and I have, some question responses, like booklet thing for them to be working on. And so I went through that booklet and just like blacked out all the stuff I didn't want the B11 students to have to do. And then beyond that, my two functionally integrated students, I just sit down with them individually and say, okay, like highlight the ones I want them to try, basically. And so it's like the same assessment. I've just kind of like taken pieces out or reworded things for students to support their learning. But I don't know, I think, differentiation is tough. And I feel like I've gotten better at it over time as I've understood my outcomes better. Because I think that that's when you first teach a class, you're just like going day to day, figuring out how to get to the end of it, right? It's like, okay, these are the outcomes I'm working on this week. I'm going to figure that out. Once you've taught the class a couple times full through, you kind of see the bigger picture of like how everything connects. And so maybe in this assignment, you don't actually need everybody to do that piece of the assignment. You just need them to do the stuff that's going to help them with the next part, and so on and so forth. But I think it's very challenging, but also I don't think it needs to be thought of as this like differentiation isn't this big extra thing on our to-do list, right? It's something that has to be added to lessons. And it's something you need to do to support students' understanding. And if you can do it in a way that supports all students' understanding better, then great, right? If you're just like thinking about that right from the get-go in terms of your planning. Yeah, so I don't really do any like formal diagnostic stuff at the beginning of a semester. I have writer's notebooks with my students. So on the first day, when they come to class, it's one of the first things they get. And I provide them to them. They get a writer's notebook, and I tell them like, this needs to come to class every day. This has to be here all the time. We will use this regularly. So on the first day of class, in every class, I typically start by talking about brave space and what it means to work within a brave space. And then at the end of class, I have them respond to the prompt, like a prompt about bravery. So like, what does bravery mean to you? Or what does it mean to be courageous? Something like that. And that first piece in their writer's notebook tells me a lot about their writing skills. So it's not formally diagnostic, but I do use it in a way that informs my future instruction. Because even just from like that basic question, right? What does bravery mean to you? I can tell from their response, their writing quality. I can tell how engaged they are in the class. I can tell their ability to organize their thoughts, how articulate they are, right? I can see all of those things in that first prompt because, you get kids who will take that question and they'll write me like basically an essay in 15 minutes. They'll sit there and write a ton. And then you have some kids who write 1 or 2 sentences if you're lucky. And so I can tell right away a lot about their skill level based on that response. And yeah, I mean, I think if you're thinking about, diagnostic work too being something throughout the semester that you're kind of checking in on regularly, that's what my writer's notebook is for. I use that a lot. And so I check the writer's notebooks, I don't know, once every few weeks usually, and just kind of look through them and comment and stuff like that. And those are a really good tell for me of where kids are at and how they're doing. Like writing notebooks, I always tell kids like grammar doesn't matter, spelling doesn't matter. I would like your text to be legible, but I'm not, like if you have to write on 2 lines of like, I don't care, just get your ideas down, right? It should be pen to paper, whatever that looks like. And some kids, with like learning exceptionalities or things, it is like sometimes tricky to decipher what's going on. That being said, that's a spot, where I would be actively offering everyone options to support needs in terms of that. So as an example, maybe I have a student, I've had students, I think it would be ridiculous to say I haven't had kids with dyslexia. Like, of course, we've had kids with dyslexia. I've taught hundreds of kids, right? And so often in cases where they feel, because to me, the writing notebook and those kinds of like formative assessments are not only about skill, but they're about confidence. And so those spaces where we're practicing our skills and we're practicing our writing should not be spaces that are punitive, in my opinion. That should not be a space where they don't feel capable. I want them to feel capable. I want them to feel confident. So get it out however you want, right? So I have some students who have asked or I've offered that they type their writer's notebook instead of writing it, like especially if they have a computer, because some kids have tech given to them by the school divisions and stuff. So if they have that, sometimes kids like to do their writer's notebook right on their phone. They'll do it on a Google Doc right on their phone. Occasionally I need someone to scribe. So sometimes that will be me. Sometimes that will be an EA or somebody else. So I typically don't call in a scribe, like bring somebody from outside the classroom in. Okay, yes. So sometimes I have to bring, if I have to bring in a scribe for like, if it's a longer piece of writing, like if I plan to do an in-class essay or I plan to do something that I know is going to require a lot more writing, I will reach out to student supports and say like, hey, on this day, I need a scribe for this kid. And they can usually figure it out for an EA to come support me that one time. But obviously that's not realistic every day. So sometimes I end up sitting next to a kid to scribe, or sometimes I'll just send them in the hall to do voice to text, stuff like that. So I think that along with that, when we look at the curriculum, the outcomes aren't assessing mechanics. So the reality is that if we're really looking at outcomes and we're really assessing what the curriculum says, then we shouldn't be punitive about mechanics and grammar. There are things that the curriculum asks us to do in terms of, semantics, morphology, like things like that. But there's no outcome in the curriculum, to my knowledge, that says they need perfect grammar and mechanics in their writing, right? Some outcomes will say, it needs to be written from this perspective, or it needs to have this tone or something like that. But in terms of mechanics and grammar, like it's my belief that we shouldn't be punitive about that. So I look at mechanics and grammar as an opportunity to teach and an opportunity to provide personalized feedback or group feedback. If I'm noticing, like, this is ridiculous, but it legitimately still happens, where grade 11s don't know the difference between there, and there. Okay. So, if I'm noticing that in a paper, it's like, well, I'm not going to just like pass over this. They need to know this. I don't want them to look, because part of it is preparing them for future conversations and correspondence. Like, I don't want you to look stupid when you email someone and use the wrong there, right? And so helping them with those things. But the short answer to your question, sorry, is that, I'm not punitive about anything in terms of mechanics and grammar. I just provide feedback on it. I thought this question was really interesting, actually, because I have never used the term redeemable to describe this practice, but that absolutely is what it is. So in terms of redeemable assessment, absolutely. I 100% stand behind the fact that students should get multiple chances to show what they know. I want students to be as successful as possible. And in my opinion, that includes assessing their best attempt at an outcome. So I have personally a hand in as many times as you want policy. But to be honest, like, so few kids really use it offering, because so few kids actually really take advantage of it. But so, in my classroom, for example, it would be, I have an essay due, they hand it in, I take it, give the feedback on my rubric, and then they have to, resubmit, like I said. And then that is the final piece. That is the best copy that I'm going to use as evidence for their final grade or for their assessment. So usually, like I said, on that, I'll give, compliment the improvements. I'll give one more piece of, like, I love that you improved this, and this sounds so much better. And, this version is much more reflective of your skill. If you choose to continue to edit, you could focus on voice, your mechanics, your transitions, like whatever I think could still be improved if they wanted to. And then that way, like, the ball's in their court. Some take advantage of it and some don't. But I think generally, I believe that we should assess their absolute best effort at that outcome. They shouldn't have a grade that reflects practice. So, that being said, there's limitations on that, right? Like time mostly, because if you're a high school ELA teacher who's teaching in a city school and you have 30 kids, 4 periods a day, and you have 120 essays to assess, like, it might not be realistic that you can take it in as many times as they want. So in that case, like, when I've been in that situation, I, set deadlines. So you can hand this assignment in as many times as you want up until this day, but I'm not taking it into April, May, and June for something we did in February, right? Or I'll look at this piece one extra time if you want me to. You need to do what works for you. But I just think, like, the reality is in the real world, like we're supposedly preparing these kids for, we get second chances, right? If we mess up, we make a mistake, we get a chance to fix it, usually, in most contexts. And I think that they should too. And if we're going to assess them based on the curriculum, we need to be assessing their best effort towards outcome. Okay, yeah. No, I am a constant reflector. Like I was saying, if I teach A30 in 2 periods in a day and I do it in period one and it goes terribly, I'm changing that lesson for the next period in some capacity. I'm constantly reflecting and constantly working to be better. And I think that this is such an important thing too, to model for students, because students often struggle with self-assessment. And so I really try to vocalize that process for my students. So if I have, say we're working on an assignment or working on something, and we've gone a few days and I can tell kids are disengaged, and probably I'm disengaged too at that point, I will come to school the next day and I'll say, okay, this isn't going well. We're going to change this. Right. And I model it for kids and say, like, I had a plan. It didn't really work. So we're going to do something different now. And I step back and I don't want the time in my class to be wasted time. And when kids are disengaged, when they're bored, when they're just doing things for compliance, that's wasted time, in my opinion. And so I'm constantly working to make those minutes matter. And I think that in terms of reevaluating a teaching style, it's just like anything else. We reevaluate it when we realize it sucks, right? Like when we realize something's not working, we're like, oh, maybe I should think about this again. Sometimes it comes from, oh, this is working, but I heard something new and I think I could incorporate that and make it better. But typically, I reevaluate a month into the semester when I'm like, oh, these kids aren't responding to this, or this isn't working. I need to change it up and, change the way that I'm doing it. And again, I think constantly like vocalizing that and articulating that for kids is really important too, so they can see an adult in the real world making mistakes, reevaluating, reassessing, and moving forward, in growth.